Check, check. Mic check. Okay, here we go. What's up, everybody? It's great to be back after a couple months off of posting new online lessons. You might be wondering, well, Sean, where have you been for the last couple months? Well, I moved to a new house, and that necessitated me building a new teaching space. And I kind of actually went whole hog when I decided to go in on this. I had an unfinished basement, and so I decided to turn the space into a really great place where I can teach lessons in person, film this YouTube content, and then also use it as a little bit of a project studio for different recordings and that type of stuff. So I'm really excited to be back at it. There's a couple changes I want to talk about to the channel that are going to happen and going to be rolled out here as we get back to things. The first thing is I really appreciate everybody subscribing to the channel and watching the videos. I've actually been pretty surprised over the last year about the response I've gotten to these videos. You know, I'm just a nobody jazz trombone player from the Midwest, and so it's great to see that people are finding these to be useful and something that can hopefully help them on their journey to being good jazz trombone players. Now, if you do enjoy these, as always, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, share these with your colleagues, with your students. I hope to continue to bring you great content, and by you doing those things, it helps me to be able to create these videos and keep them coming to you for free. Now, if over the past year you've enjoyed this content and find that you want a little bit more support in practicing some of these concepts, I'm actually going ahead and started a Patreon page where you can access some additional material to support these lessons. It'll be things like handouts that include all the examples that we go over in our lessons here, but also maybe some of them written out in all 12 keys, possibly some of them extended a little bit for you to practice. In addition, you'll also be able to access some play-alongs and actually some practice videos that sort of accompany these lessons in order for you to practice all of this material. That'll be me playing with some play-alongs that are tailored specifically to each lesson to practice through some of the content. It might be playing licks in all 12 keys. It might be working through a particular harmonic concept. It might be working through some sort of phrase structure, but we'll work through this together, and I think that'll be a great way for you to be able to take this material and really move it into the practice room so you can improve the best way possible. You can find all the important details about that down in the description of the video. So if you are interested, I encourage you to go down there, click on the Patreon page, and check out what I'm offering there. I think it's going to be a real exciting addition for those of you who want just a little more in-depth coverage of some of these concepts. All right, now that the business is out of the way, let's dig into what we're going to talk about today. When I was thinking about what I wanted the first lesson to be coming back from a little hiatus, I really tried to think about what do I find many of my students struggling with? Or what is something that kind of cuts across all my students as far as ability level, experience level? And that is all of us, including myself, need to work on simplifying our playing. Now, before you hit next in this video and think, Sean, I've heard this advice before. Lots of people have told me I need to simplify or I need to edit down my playing. I would encourage you to stick around and just see sort of my take on this. I don't necessarily mean you need to play less or leave more space or any of that type of stuff. You need to focus on clarity of ideas. And oftentimes when we think about simplifying, that can lead to clear ideas that really land for the listener and also land with our other members of the ensemble that we might be playing with. There are two main areas that we're going to dig into today. One is how we deal with harmony, and the second is how we deal with phrasing. We're going to start with the harmonic portion. We're going to look at a basic concept and then also something that's a little bit more advanced in how we can think about simplifying and clarity as it applies to both of these things. The first thing we're going to look at is how we deal with arpeggios, how we practice arpeggios, and then how we take that information and apply it to our solos. So as jazz musicians, most of us have probably spent a fair amount of time practicing tunes in this sort of fashion. So that's the first 4 bars of a B-flat blues, and I was just arpeggiating up through each chord from the root. Now I also like to add what would be called an approach note going to each one of those roots. I just think it's a good way for students to think about getting sort of some non-harmonic tones and something that sounds a little more idiomatic into their actual lines. This type of practice is fundamental. We all do this on many different types of tunes, maybe as we're learning the tunes or as we're just trying to gain good control of how we play arpeggios and really knowing the changes. The challenge here is when we take this relatively complicated way of playing arpeggios where we're really trying to hit every note and really indicate every change, when we put that into practice, it can end up sounding not so musical. And so oftentimes when I'm working on this with students, I have to encourage them or really require them to simplify how they're thinking these arpeggios. We're not trying to pass a test or sort of like prove that we know the changes. We're trying to use these note choices to build melodies at the end of the day. And we want to be able to do that by actually choosing less of the arpeggio to play. We might only play 2 or 3 or even 1 note from the arpeggio, and then really think about the voice leading between those notes to help us build these melodies. So rather than thinking about, hey, I've got to get every note in, I'm just going to choose 1, 2, 3 notes and think about how they connect to each other. Let's check out how that would sound over an entire chorus of B-flat blues. So hopefully you could hear how this sort of like limited way that I was choosing notes from the arpeggios really got me thinking about voice leading and thinking about how can I connect certain notes to each other, and really got me thinking about maybe leaving a little more space, playing with a little better phrasing, all that type of stuff. So just trying to simplify and clarify that arpeggio information can lead us in this direction. Okay, cool. That is a relatively basic concept that all of us need to have control over. Let's talk about a slightly more advanced harmonic concept that we can still think about simplifying and bringing clarity to have it land better during our solos. Now, there are many directions you can go when you want to make your harmonic palette a little bit more complex. Today, we're just going to talk about one. This is one that I often play and you'll hear all over jazz, and that is sidestepping 2/5s. Now, before we dig into what this actually is, it's important to remember, the more complex an idea is, the more clearly we need to play it and we need to execute it. As we're playing in something that we often want to sort of sound in relief of the changes, or that we have the chords as a foundation and these sort of like quote unquote outside elements, they stand apart from those changes and eventually we resolve. So when we play these outside elements, we really need to make sure we're playing in tune with a good sound, with good time. So that way we don't just sound, quite frankly, wrong. That it really sounds like those choices are sounding like tension. We're outside of the chords, and then hopefully we eventually resolve back into the chords in maybe an interesting or musically satisfying way. So it's very, very important that we focus on clarity the more complex our ideas become. All right, back to our sidestepping 2/5-1s. So when we refer to a sidestepping 2/5-1, it's a chord substitution approach where instead of just playing a standard 2/5-1, on the 2 chord, we are going to play a 2/5-1 that is a half step up. So for example, we're going to look at the tune It Could Happen to You. We're going to look at the 3rd and 4th phrase, so basically bars 9 through, I guess that would be 16 or 17, depending on how you slice it. This tune, or that section of the tune, ends with a 2/5-1 to E flat. Most people play this tune in E flat. So it's an F minor 7 to B flat 7. Now we are going to substitute this sidestepping 2/5-1. So instead, we're going to shove that F minor 7 into the very last bar. So we get a 1-bar 2/5-1. And then in the second to last bar, we're going to play an F sharp minor 7 to B 7 to F minor 7 to B flat 7. Essentially what we're doing is we're putting a tritone sub on the 2 chord. That is really what's happening here. But because we have the same gesture that sort of moves down chromatically, it gives us some good ways we can sort of like manipulate lines through this area of the harmony. I chose this tune to illustrate this concept because people very often play this substitution at this point in the harmony. You could really do this on any 2/5, but you will find there are places where people tend to do it more often than other ones. And in this one, when we go from the 6th chord, the C minor 7 chord, to the F7 chord, which is like a dominant version of the 2 chord, and then we eventually resolve to 2, and we have that gesture where it's like 6-2, 2-5. This is a very, very common chord substitution that people like to use. Let's look at some examples of some lines we might want to play on this. Now, as I said, simplicity and clarity is what we're going for here. So let's look at a line first that maybe does not subscribe to that so much. It's still going to be a good 2/5-1 line. However, if we were to use it in this context, it's actually going to sort of like muddy the waters a little bit and obscure what we're really going for. Let's check it out with a play along. Okay, great. So our lick is this. Now on its own, that's a nice little slick 2-5 lick. We just arpeggiate down through the 2 chord, and then we hit some of the alterations on the 5 chord. It's the alterations on the 5 chord that really are going to be problematic for using that idea here, because again, it just doesn't provide as much clarity. We're already kind of like stretching the harmony a little bit, so then we add all these alterations. It just sort of like obscures what we're trying to do. We don't really hear that 2-5-1 up a half step in relief because of those alterations. So instead, we want to try to keep our ideas very simple on this because the harmony is already shifting in a maybe slightly unconventional way. Let's look what that would sound like. All right, great. Now clearly there's a significant amount of subjectivity here about which one sounds better, but I think the second option really gets at like what these changes sound like and allows us again to hear them in relief of the rest of the tune. We really clearly hear that F sharp to B7, and then we really clearly hear that F minor to B flat 7 because we're keeping the idea so simple and so clear. Let's put this into context of the entire last 8 bars. If you're looking for some more examples of these type of ideas that I think really land well in this harmonic structure, go ahead and check out that Patreon page. This is the type of stuff that will be included in a handout and that we'll practice through in all 12 keys through some of those practice videos. So hopefully that'll be a good resource to get some of this vocabulary under your fingers. So there are a few examples of how simplifying our harmonic approach can help give us more clarity in our playing and improve our solos. For most people, we can do this immediately. Not something that requires a ton of practice. We just have to sort of take a step back, get some perspective about what's really important about playing the changes. Now, onto the phrasing section of how we need to simplify our lines. When we're talking about simplifying and more importantly, clarifying our phrasing, we really want to think about what makes a good phrase. There's not really rules about what makes a good phrase, but there are certainly characteristics that many musically satisfying phrases have. Let's just look at a couple of those and see how we can take some of the ideas that we might play and shift them into having these like good characteristics that we know are going to be satisfying. And when we focus on creating these satisfying phrases with these sort of things, that is going to make our lines sound more convincing without really having to learn new language. For my money, the first characteristic of a good phrase is that it has a clear beginning, middle, and end. Each phrase should kind of tell us a little story or have a clear starting point, go somewhere, and then eventually resolve or possibly send us into the next phrase. Let's look at this in context of maybe a less good phrase and then a better phrase, or more just a phrase that better characterizes these type of things. So let's check it out. Cool. Now there's certainly nothing wrong with that. We're playing through the first 4 bars of a B flat blues. And as we'll see, I'm, outlining the changes clearly. I have, some good kind of vocabulary in there, things that we would expect to hear in a solo. But to me, it just doesn't quite land in a satisfying way and in a really clear way. Let's look how I can just tweak that phrase a little bit and make it into something that, at least for me, feels a little bit better. Cool. Now, a lot of that phrase was very similar. We start in a very similar fashion. I really tried to kind of stick with some of the same sort of chord tone resolution points. However, there are a few more rests in there. I really was looking for places where I could end and start, or have a middle point and then start again. For this particular phrase, for example, I think it has a very clear beginning of the phrase. And then we have that sort of like middle resting point where I end on the end of 4. On the E flat chord. And then in this case, I actually sort of like play into the next phrase. Rather than really feeling like I resolve at the end of 4 bars, I'm sort of setting up the next 4 bars. And so this idea of having clear phrases is, in my mind's eye, again, another way that we simplify our playing. Rather than thinking I need to fill up every inch of space with hip harmonic ideas or interesting rhythmic development, I really just need to think about creating clarity in my phrases, and that's what's going to drive my solo forward. All right, our second characteristic of a good phrase is that it has one clear main idea. Now, all of our phrases are going to have variation in them and a number of different ideas. And actually, the one I just played had probably a couple different ideas in it. But if we can think about really boiling things down to what is one good idea and then maybe developing it, it again can give us a more clear direction in our solo. Let's take a look at this again in maybe a not so great example or something where my ideas are a little bit more scattered to then something that has a more focused idea. Okay, cool. So really working in the blues scale or the minor pentatonic scale there. But for my money, rather than having one clear idea, I really have kind of three ideas there. I start with that little 3-note motive, and then it looks like I might kind of extend that, develop it, but then I just throw it out the window and go somewhere else. That motive kind of comes back, but then I just go to sort of a different 2-note motive. So instead, let's look at how maybe we could stretch that first motive out across the entire 4 bars to, again, create more clarity, and in this case, a much more simple phrase structure. Now, clearly, these are just different musical ideas, but I think the second one is just more satisfying to play, more satisfying to listen. It starts somewhere, it goes somewhere, and it's really all just those 3-note groupings. And the more we can look for those little kernels of ideas and then do something with them, rather than thinking about every idea under the sun, I think leads to more effective soloing. All right, the final way that we can think about simplifying and clarifying our phrases is by asking ourselves, am I playing in a stylistically idiomatic fashion? So often, I find that my students are actually playing good ideas. However, the way they play them is what makes them sound not authentic or not convincing. And we need to think, am I playing in tune with a good sound? And in this case, am I playing with sort of the typical ways that we phrase, articulate, all that type of stuff for the style of music we're playing. Now in jazz, there's certainly a kind of set of guidelines or norms, a pretty broad set, admittedly. There's a lot of things you could play that would be quote unquote correct, but it's gonna depend on the style of music you're playing. If you're playing a funk gig, some of those rules of the road are gonna be different than if you're playing a straight ahead jazz gig or a salsa gig or a classical gig. It really just depends on the type of music you're playing, but you've got to make sure that you're adhering to those rules of the road and then maybe deviating from them slightly, but really letting them guide you. So let's look at an example. First, I'm going to play with very, very little sort of like jazz style, quote unquote. I am going to play swung 8th notes, but it's not really going to feel too interesting. Probably feel a little bland. Right notes, right rhythms, all that kind of stuff, but it just feels a little placid for my taste. So what if we just change that and think a little bit more about what is kind of going to fit into the style? To me, that's just much more convincing. I didn't change any of the notes, any of the rhythms. I added a little grace note in there, but I really didn't change anything. I just thought about, am I playing this in a way that's going to feel good if the rhythm section is playing swing behind me? Okay, cool. Let's throw all these things into the bucket and see what happens. First, I'm going to try to play a solo where I really don't adhere to these things. I'm just going to play sort of meandering lines without necessarily good beginnings and endings. I'm not necessarily going to try to play in the style, and I'm just going to try to throw a bunch of ideas against the wall, see what sticks. Then in the second chorus, I'm going to really try to adhere to these things. Think about my phrases having good beginnings, middles, ends, clear one idea phrases, and then really think about the style. Now you'll notice I'm probably going to play a lot less notes in the second solo. I'm improvising. I did not write these out ahead of time, and so we're just going to see what happens here, but surely in the second solo, I'm going to play less, and it's probably going to sound simpler in some ways, but for me, that's really where clarity comes from. Let's check it out. All right, hopefully those two choruses really illustrated the things that we talked about in this entire lesson. we really want to focus on simplicity, clarity in our playing. Now, that doesn't mean we don't play any interesting harmonic things or really work to play the full spectrum of what we think of as the jazz language. But instead, that we think about that language needs to be executed in a clear fashion, and that we need to say statements that the listener, ourselves, and our fellow musicians can understand, not just sort of throwing everything out there and hoping some of it works. All right, that wraps us up for this week. I look forward to getting back and sharing content with all of you each week with these online lessons. I encourage you to check out some of those supplemental materials that I'm now offering. And let me know in the comments if that's something that you're interested in, or if there are any videos or topics that you would be interested in me covering. All right, we'll see all of you in the woodshed.